Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to this seminar organized together between the Global Center of the Columbia University and the Athena Lab. I'd like to tell you that we have simultaneous translation English to Spanish, and to listen to the translation, you have to click on the globe icon that you can find at the bottom side of your screen,
Y elegir el idioma
and
en el
then
que
pick the
gustaría
language in which you
escuchar.
want to listen to this conference original audio in the event that you don't need translation.
Hoy, David
Today,
Rothkopf,
David
CEO de
Rothkopf,
Rothkopf
CEO
Group
of
y
the
ex
Rothkopf
director de
Group
la revista
and
Foreign
former
Policy,
director of the Foreign Policy
estará con
magazine, will be
Karen
talking to Karen
Poniatic, directora
Poniachik,
del Centro
director of the Global
Global
Center
Center
from
from
the
the
Columbia
Columbia
University,
University,
and John
y jefe de
Griffiths,
seguridad y
Chief
defensa de
of
Athena Lab,
Security Studies and
sobre su
Defense of
perspectiva
Athena
de
Lab, about
seguridad
the
para Estados
challenges
Unidos y
regarding
la
safe
administración
security
Biden.
for the United States
En
under
la
the Biden
conferencia
administration.
podrán
During the
elegir sus
conference, you
preguntas
will be
y
able
la
to write
respuesta de
your
preguntas y
questions using the
respuestas en la parte
Q&A
inferior del
section on the bottom side of
Zoom,
the screen,
las que pueden ser en
which
español.
you can write
Entonces,
in
para
Spanish if
empezar,
you want.
necesito conocer
So
a
to
Karen
begin, I
Poniatic,
would like
directora
to give the
del
floor to
Global
Karen Poniacic,
Center de
director of
Columbia,
the
y luego
Global
el
Columbia
CEO
Center. So
de
we'll give us an
Athena.
introduction and
Entonces,
present this conference and Professor Rothkopf.
Thank you very much, Fernanda.
Muchas gracias.
We're delighted to join forces with our friends from Athena Lab and to host a very good friend of mine for many years, David Rothkopf, CEO of the Rothkopf Group, and most recently, as Fernanda explained, author of Traitor, A History of American Betrayal from Benedict Arnold to Donald Trump, an expert on U.S. foreign policy, on international affairs. He's also, I have all of these. He's also author of Power Inc. and Superclass, among many other books, including Running the World, about the National Security Council. And he'll tell us about his two new books, hopefully. But David, we've been following you through Twitter. You've been tweeting a lot these last few days, writing a lot on what's happening in the U.S. This conference is entitled the security challenges or the security issues that the Biden administration will have to confront. And obviously, for the first time, probably, the domestic front is the main security threat to the United States. So I'll turn the screen over to you for about 15 minutes. I'm sure you want to start with the domestic front and then shoot Russia, Iran, China. There's a lot to be worried about. But I think the domestic front is definitely the most important one. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Karen. Thanks to all of you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to have this chance to talk to you. I'll talk for 10 or 15 minutes about these things, but I'm happy to answer questions if there's areas that I have not covered. It's a old tradition in U.S. foreign policy for presidents to come in and say our real focus is domestic. And it dates back a long, long time. The United States has always had a kind of natural resistance, contrary to what many people around the world think, to getting too involved overseas, dating back to George Washington and George Kennan, who was one of the great thinkers of U.S. foreign policy after the end of the Second World War, when he wrote his long telegram, which kicked off the beginning of the Cold War, ended it by saying, we will win this Cold War by setting a good example at home, succeeding at home, and again, driving home this emphasis. But what we face today is somewhat different from the platitudes of the past. The reality is that the biggest threats to the United States are domestic threats. For the past several years, I would argue that the biggest threat that the United States has faced is actually from its own president. And now we are in an extraordinary moment in US history in which there are 20,000 troops gathered in Washington, D.C., 4 times the number of troops that we have deployed in Afghanistan. And those troops are deployed to protect the United States Capitol and the incoming president from our current president. They're there to protect the United States from Donald Trump and from Donald Trump's supporters. And they're there to do that, of course, because last week on January 6th, Donald Trump incited a mob to go and essentially launch a coup attempt against the United States government against the constitutional processes which are involved in ratification of our incoming president. I think we will find in the next several weeks and months that the effort, which brought perhaps 15,000 people to Washington, many of them in combat gear, many of them with plans, it turns out, to perhaps kidnap members of Congress, perhaps kill members of Congress, perhaps kill the Vice President of the United States, were coming not simply because of the inflammatory language of Donald Trump, but they were coming because somebody funded them to get there. And the people who funded that may well be tied closely to people in and around the president, because of people associated with the president whose groups helped fund this thing, which was called Stop the Steal. Because since the election, since before the election, actually, Donald Trump has been trying to spread the idea that the US election was stolen from him, that he deserved to win it, and that whether it was bad voting machines or changed laws or some other combination of things, the election was taken from him. What he was doing, though, was he was tapping into a deep well of anger that exists within groups in the far right in the United States. And I think when you talk to the US national security, the team that's joining Joe Biden, you will find that they will say domestic terrorism is going to be one of their top national security concerns. That is a striking difference from the past 20 years or so, when foreign terrorism topped the list, or Russia or the rise of China topped the list. There are 33% of the American people, according to a poll I saw yesterday, who support Trump, even though perhaps 90% say they oppose the insurrection that took place last week on the Capitol. And the reason I raise that is that if 33% of the American people support Donald Trump in the wake of his collusion with Russia, in the wake of his obstruction of justice, in the wake of his corruption, manifold corruption, his family and he benefiting directly from his period in the government, in the wake of him being impeached not once but twice, the first president in American history to be impeached twice. If there is still that base of support, it's not really for him. It's not really about him. It's about deep grievance. And I think that grievance at its root is essentially white supremacist racism. The United States is undergoing a massive change between now and the year 2044. We're going to go from being a country that for 240 odd years was dominated by white, mostly white male majority. And by 2044, the groups that we once described as minorities will move into the majority. And this is irreversible. But that, of course, displaces a number of people who felt entitled. And of course, the United States has been racked by problems associated with racism throughout its history, including through the Civil War. The formula of Donald Trump as a demagogue was to tap into that grievance, to tap into that racism fairly directly, to mobilize this group in order to gain political support, not to deliver things for that group, but actually to deliver things for his donor group, which is essentially the 1% in the United States. And we've seen over the past 40 years another trend in which inequality has grown in the United States, so that while the top 1% have seen their net worths grow, and while they were the ones who benefited from growth post-2009 crisis, for 40 years, the median wage in the United States has remained flat. For 40 years, the minimum wage in the United States has actually, if you adjust it for inflation, gone down. So the vast majority of the population is being left further and further behind, and the rich in the population are benefiting more and more, often with the help of people like Trump, who are drawing on the frustrations of people left behind by the inequality to actually worsen that inequality. So you have a country that has a president who is a threat, but even deeper threat than that is a polarized society in which the far right is motivated by racial issues and by economic issues. And that's not going to go away. It's not going to go away when Donald Trump goes away. And so I think that's, the imminent threat. There's an American author named Jack London who wrote about the Arctic, and he used to talk about the wolf closest to the sled, and you're in the middle of the snow, you have to worry about the wolf closest to the sled. And the wolf closest to the sled right now is insurrection. But right next to it is the world's worst COVID crisis. We've passed officially 400,000 dead in the United States in 11 months. But actually, the real estimate is probably closer to 550,000 dead. We're likely to see another 400,000 dead in the next couple of months. Well over 20 million Americans have had COVID, and it's quite possible that it's more like 40 million Americans have had COVID. The vaccine program, which has just started, is lagging terribly, and it is a brewing crisis. And the other thing Joe Biden's going to have to do, and he spoke about this in a speech today, is he's going to have to come in. He says he's going to deliver 100 million doses of the vaccine to 100 million people in the first 100 days. That's not actually that ambitious. We're around delivering about 1 million shots a day. But unless he gets that addressed, then we're not going to have economic recovery. We have enormous unemployment as a result of this, and that's going to feed the instability. It's going to be very, very hard for Joe Biden and his incoming team to deal with any issues anywhere in the world. Having said that, and in the final 5 minutes, let me say, they're going to make a big effort to normalize U.S. foreign policy. All the people in the Biden team are experienced people. Most of them were in the Obama team. They know them well. They know each other well. I know these people extremely well. I've worked with many of these people for 20 or 30 years. They are bright. They are humane. They are competent. They are traditionalists. They are going to want to see the United States begin again to work constructively with allies, begin again to work constructively within multilateral institutions, to strengthen those multilateral institutions. And their priorities are going to be completely different from the priorities of Donald Trump. Donald Trump's first international priority was Donald Trump and the Trump Organization. His second one was Donald Trump and the Trump Organization. His third one was Donald Trump and the Trump Organization. He really did not do much to advance U.S. foreign policy, and you could see that in the way that he placated the Russians, played footsie with autocrats around the world. You're not going to see that from Joe Biden. Joe Biden has brought in John Kerry, a former Secretary of State, to lead the biggest team we've ever had prioritizing climate. He's brought in Tony Blinken, who is his longtime foreign policy advisor, to run the State Department, who will work to reaffirm alliances and get back into multilateral agreements wherever they took place. Jake Sullivan, who's the new national security advisor, and Bill Burns, who's the incoming CIA director, both worked together in the Obama administration to negotiate the Iran deal alongside John Kerry. They're very invested in this kind of multilateral agreements. And so you'll see the U.S. re-enter the Paris Accord. You'll see the U.S. re-enter the World Health Organization. You'll see the U.S. refund and get back engaged in the United Nations in a constructive, not mischievous way. You'll see the United States seek to come up with a JCPOA, which is the deal with Iran plus, a better deal there. You'll see the United States seek to formulate a policy with regard to the Indo-Pacific region that is more constructive and less inflammatory. A senior level person has been created in the White House to be in charge of the Indo-Pacific region. And this, for those of you who are students of foreign policy, is a bit of a shift. We don't call it Asia Pacific anymore because you have to include India in the mix if you're going to counterbalance China. And the Quad, which is the mechanism we use in Asia as kind of the anchor of our security, which is Japan, the United States, India, and Australia, is going to be the foundation of that. But I think you'll see a lot of effort made to shore up those relationships, prioritize Asia. I think there'll be a lot of pressure on China. I think there'll be a lot of pressure on Russia. I think there will be a new push again to promote democracy. And we can come back to this, but I think once again, despite the fact that people will say something to the contrary, Latin America will not be a top priority for the United States, as it never is, not in a constructive way anyway. So I think that gives you a bit of an overview, and I'm very happy to address the people, the policies, the shifts, where we were or where we are going.
Well, David, thank you very much for your conference. I would like to initiate the Q&A phase, asking the first question. As you mentioned, the National Security Council team is going to be formed by many veterans. Among them, the elected president nominated for the National Security Council as the Western Hemisphere advisor, Mr. Juan Gonzalez, which is the Colombian American. The question is, how do you think, even when we already know that we are not an important region or strategic region in the world, however, for Latin American people and for the Chileans, it's a very important bilateral relation with the US. How do you think is going to be the main effort of President Biden to the region and the main advisor?
Well, I think one of the first things that the Biden administration is going to do almost anywhere is reverse the things that the Trump administration did that they don't approve of. So, you know, the Trump administration has been trying to sort of go back to a throwback policy with Cuba. I think there's going to be an effort to reverse that. You've seen relationships develop between Trump and a couple of leaders in the region that I think are going to be problems for those leaders going forward. The worst, of course, is Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who is, you know, trying to out-Trump Trump at every corner. And I think, you know, Bolsonaro will approach Biden cautiously. The United States will seek to normalize a bit there. But Bolsonaro's bad attitude towards Trump, towards COVID, towards democracy, towards racial equality, to, you name it, you know, that's going to be a problem for Bolsonaro. I think there will be a similar problem, although kind of lower degree problem with AMLO in Mexico, because Mexico, you know, is on the US border. We have a lot of shared interest. There's going to be an effort made to reverse, I think, some of the most draconian Trump policies with regard to immigration, the abuses that took place on the border, the focus on the wall. I think you will see reversals with regard to that in Mexico and also in Central America. And I think that will be a priority. I don't think you'll see a big change in the way the United States treats the Maduro administration. And I think where we can go back to having fairly normal relations, as we have traditionally had with Chile, or you know, I think they'll try to go back to that, because I think their desire is going to be to have what they view as a traditional US foreign policy, engaged, positive, leaderly, with perhaps a greater focus than in the past on multilateral issues, on climate as an issue, and so forth.
Thank you.
Thanks. If I may follow up with another issue, which is of great interest and importance for Chile, where we're having Chinese companies, state-owned Chinese companies investing in strategic sectors such as energy transmission, energy distribution, management of toll roads, and more on the way. The United States has this Council on Foreign Investment, which is an interagency committee that reviews foreign investment in order to determine the effects of these transactions on the national security of the United States. Most recently, it got involved, this is headed by the Treasury Department. Most recently, it got involved in the TikTok deal, which didn't work out. So what do you know about, they never go public, but what do you know about this CFI-US?
Yeah, the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States, which is referred to by its acronym in the US government, which is CFIUS, it's going to be a problem for people who have active investment from the Chinese government, from Chinese tech sector companies. I think that you can expect, frankly, on the international stage for some time to come, internet security, technology privacy, cyber issues, cybersecurity, cyber defense, to play a bigger and bigger role. The United States has been distracted for a while. And when Trump was getting involved with the TikTok deal or the Huawei deal, he was always viewing it in a kind of a transactional way. Like, if China doesn't do what I want, I'm going to punish them with this deal. I don't think that's going to be the approach of the Biden administration. I do think, however, they're going to be extremely concerned about Chinese government ownership of technology companies, about the ability of that ownership to lead Chinese technologies to create vulnerabilities for companies and countries that trade with them, whether that is implanting devices, backdoors into computers, backdoors into networks, whether it is stealing technology, whether it's violating privacy, whether it's harvesting data. I think all of those things are going to be big problems. And honestly, personally, my view is that the only way that this is going to be solvable, and I know some of the senior people coming into the Biden administration agree with me on this, is going to be a multilateral mechanism to deal with, to set, first of all, standards regarding technology security, internet security, privacy, and so forth, and then to come up with dispute resolutions among them. Because I think continuing to do this on a bilateral basis, or even worse, on a case-by-case basis, company by company, is just going to prove unwieldy, particularly as these threats proliferate. China is going to grow. It's going to be involved in more sectors. It's going to be a threat. There's a Russian threat. There's an Iranian threat. There are threats from allies and companies that just simply create security loopholes that make things more risky. So I will expect that this administration is going to be a bit of a problem on issues like that, for a good reason, and because this is a transitional period. Hopefully, at some point in the not too distant future, there's going to be one set of rules. Everybody will know what the rules are. They'll adopt the rules together, and there will be a dispute resolution mechanism. But I wouldn't expect that for 4, 5, 6 years.
Okay, David, I do have a question of one of our participants. Good afternoon, Mr. Rothkofp. Regarding the situation in the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific, do you think the Biden administration will continue with free navigation operations and with the free and open Indo-Pacific initiative? That's the question.
Yeah, I like to give long, thoughtful answers in this kind of a setting, but my answer is just yes. I can elaborate on that if you like, but I just, I think countering China, maintaining free flow of navigation in the South China Sea through the Straits of Taiwan, through the Straits of Malacca is extremely important. It's not just important to the United States, it's vital to the survival of Japan. It's vital to the Koreans. It's very important to the Australians. I think the United States is very conscious that what China was trying to do with the Belt and Road Initiative was to build, sea lanes and overland trade routes, not just for economic reasons, but for strategic reasons. And we have a similar goal, and the Chinese are going to test us. And I would say, if you're going to make a list of the 5 sort of hot spots in the world, not that I think that a war is going to break out there, but I believe that 3 of them have to do with China. One of them is the South China Sea. One of them has to do with the anti-democracy crackdown in Hong Kong. And one of them has to do with the continuing abuse in Northwest China of the Uyghurs.
Okay, thank you.
Let's move, if I may move to another hotspot, probably in your list of 5 is Russia, right? So we have several issues about Russia. Most recently, we found out that Russia had been hacking several government agencies and private companies for 9 months. They just found out now. Then there's the issue with Nord Stream 2, the pipeline that connects Russia with Germany that will provide natural gas if it's ever finished. And of course, Putin. So can you elaborate on those?
Well, first of all, I think
it's long supermarket list. But...
Well, first of all, I think it's essential, and I think Biden thinks it's essential, to go into Russia and say, I'm not Donald Trump. We're going back to the way we were. Biden has had, tough talks with Putin before. So has Tony Blinken. So has Bill Burns at the CIA. So has Jake Sullivan. So all of the leadership have been involved in those kind of exchanges. And of course, in particular, they were involved in tension during the Obama administration over Ukraine. Those issues are unresolved as well. And I think further Russian adventurism in their near abroad, including potentially in the Baltic region, is certainly going to raise some concerns in addition to what you said. The hack that you're talking about, which is known by the name of the app that they got into, SolarWinds, may be the biggest hack that the United States has ever suffered. We don't know the damage that has been done. We know many agencies of the US government were hacked. We don't know whether data was stolen, whether software was put in to these places that may give them access in the future or the ability to damage these networks in the future. We don't know if secure information was taken. Right now, there's a conclusion that perhaps it wasn't, but we don't know. And so I think that, first of all, there's going to be a protracted investigation. And secondly, I think there's going to be a newfound effort to prioritize both cybersecurity and developing the kinds of doctrines that are necessary for deterrence. And those don't really exist. The United States and most countries in the world don't really have the same kind of doctrines they do with traditional forms of warfare, where if you attack kinetically, you respond kinetically. You know what a proportional response is. But what's a proportional kinetic response to a cyber attack? We don't know. We don't have those metrics. That's one of the next areas of challenge for strategic planners going forward. As far as Nord Stream goes, I think the big challenge there is also going to be dealing with new European leadership. And right, the way European leadership is constituted is changing dramatically. The UK is no longer part of Europe. Having said that, the UK leadership has sort of left the planet Earth anyway, and so they're not super helpful. But you know, the real leader of the Western world for many of the past few years has been Angela Merkel, and she's going. You know, she's delivering farewell addresses. You know, she's been a very successful leader. I think the world owes her a debt of gratitude, because when there was a void with the United States, she, in many important ways, stepped up. But what's going to happen next? And is Europe going to remain cohesive? Or are the divisions between North and South in Europe going to make it harder for them to maintain policy coherence? We don't know. And certainly we haven't seen how that works with US leadership, because the United States has been disengaged because Trump inflamed European allies. He didn't get along with Angela Merkel. His ambassador to Germany was persona non grata there. He tried to have a decent relationship, or Macron tried to have a decent relationship, and then that relationship fell apart. You know, even as recently as last week, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was planning to make a farewell trip to Europe, and Luxembourg said no thanks. You know, they sort of told him to go jump in a lake, and so, you know, I think job number one is going to be repairing the U.S.-European relationship. Job number two is going to be setting a mission for the Atlantic Alliance, and I think number three is going to be sending a message to Putin saying, "Don't test us, because we will come back at you with all the means that are available to us to defend our interests."
Okay. Thank you, David. I do have another question. Taking into consideration that the main security strategic challenge to the United States are going to be, are indeed China, North Korea, and Iran, how do you see is going to be the main issue in the Biden foreign policy to face those challenges? And as you said, or just mentioned, that one of the problems is going to rebuild alliance to face together those current challenges.
Well, I think there's an answer there in the question, which is, the most important thing the United States needs to do is to say we are re-engaging with the world, and we're not doing it alone, and that we recognize that our leadership going forward is different from what our leadership might have been, say, in the Cold War, when you had a bipolar world, or even in the 90s, or the early part of this century, when you had a kind of unipolar world, where you had the United States as what the French called the hyper power, the one great superpower in the world. I think the United States has to be a better partner at the same time that it is a leader. I think the United States wants to share the burden more. I think the United States wants to work within the mechanisms of international institutions. I think we are going to see a slow fade on one of the most odious concepts in American foreign policy, which is American exceptionalism. The idea that the United States can play by other rules than any other country. It's not going to disappear entirely, I'm willing to bet, but it will recede, because I don't think, there's a generational change that's taking place in U.S. foreign policy making too right now. Jake Sullivan is the youngest national security advisor since McGeorge Bundy in the Kennedy administration. He's 43 years old, and that's a big difference. He's not, John Kerry, who's in the administration, was a Vietnam era person. Tony Blinken, who is 56, I think, 50, maybe 50, something like that, mid 50s. 20 years ago on 9/11, he was in his mid 30s. Most of his professional life has been the post 9/11 era, the post 9/11 United States. And so you're going to see a change in attitudes. I should add, by the way, I'm just going to offer this up here as a footnote. But this administration is following in the footsteps of the Chilean administration, including the one in which Karen served, because it has come closer to gender parity in its senior ranks than any administration in history, and very close to gender parity in the cabinet, at the sub-cabinet level, even more so. I think I saw a data point yesterday where something like of 20 directors and senior directors at the National Security Council that have been appointed, 18 were women. So, that's another change in the tone of the United States government that you're going to see here, shaping the alliances. That's, reshaping alliances, thinking of multilateral institutions for the 21st century. I call it present at the creation 2.0. There was a book written by an American Secretary of State after World War II called Present at the Creation, about creating the sort of global order after World War II. Well, we have to create a new global order. And I think that this job of work would have fallen to Trump if he were constructive, going to fall to the Biden team. I think Iran is going to be about getting back to that deal. I think China is going to be about trying to establish a balance between economic interdependence and geopolitical rivalry, particularly with a special emphasis on kind of human rights and democracy issues that have been neglected. As I said, I think the issue with Russia is going to be containing them and to some degree managing what could be a implosion within Russia, as the country has a lot of internal problems.
Thank you.
Sorry, should I go again, Joan, or you have more questions? Because I have a question of internal security going back to what you started your presentation with. So what's the strategy to deal with this ultra-right, nationalistic, racist groups? Is the FBI equipped, prepared? How are they going to manage?
Well, that's kind of the big question in the United States right now. I think for some time, 2 administrations at least, there has been talk of the rise of ultra right-wing terrorists in the United States as a problem. And even during the Clinton administration, you had the Oklahoma City bombing, you had other kinds of groups, other kinds of incidents where right-wing terrorists played a role. But it has certainly not been as prominent an issue as it is now. The grievances have not been as great. And, I'm very loath to start, blaming our social ills on social media. It seems like, I don't know, sometimes I say it and I feel like I'm some, 1950s parent saying that rock and roll is going to destroy all of you kids. But the reality is that social media has made it possible for people with extremist views who might not have found in their community a lot of other people with extremist views, connect and find like-minded people across the country. And when they create communities like that, the ideas within those communities feed on themselves. There's a kind of a greenhouse effect. They get hotter and hotter. They make bolder and bolder claims. And I really feel that that's an issue. It's not just the rise of extremism, it's a rise of extremism in the age of social media, in the age of borders and distance and boundaries not really mattering, in the age of 2 distinct information spheres in the United States. That's part of this whole problem that we've faced in this election. Half the country listens to right-wing news. They don't believe in climate change. They don't believe that the election was run fairly. They don't think that Donald Trump colluded with the Russians. They don't believe in science. Many of them don't believe in vaccinations. They don't, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got one group, and the other group, they're more empirically driven. But no matter what you say to try to persuade somebody that something is real, including showing a picture of it, they'll deny it. And right now in right-wing media, they're saying left-wing extremists led the attack on the Capitol. Antifa, the anti-fascist groups led. There's no evidence. Donald Trump says, the election was stolen. There is no evidence. They don't care. And so when you have this kind of ecosystem, I call it ecosystem, meaning echo, in English, like a sound bouncing back to you, and like ecosystem, when you have this kind of ecosystem, it's very, very hard to control the evolution of thought. And we're at a moment where no law enforcement organization is in a position to do that. Final point I'd make is, of the people who've been arrested so far for last week's attacks, a bunch of them have been in the police. There has been a lot of debate about institutional racism in the United States. There are in the military and in police forces white supremacist elements. And so it's very hard to combat white supremacy when you've got organizations that are full of white supremacists, or even have a few white supremacists in them who sort of leak and so forth. So it's a challenge, but I have to say, what happened last week was a shock to the system. To the United States, what happened on January 6th was like what happened on September 11th, 2001. It was one of those things that was not supposed to happen here, that said we are vulnerable in ways we never knew we were vulnerable before, and that if we're not careful, we can actually lose American democracy. And I'm not overstating that. I really believe it was kind of a near-death experience for American democracy.
Perfect. David, taking into consideration that we were talking about internal issues, this week there was a statement from the Joint Chief of Staff, a memorandum calling for the respect of the United States Constitution. How we should read how we do perceive the message that the Joint Chief of Staff wanted to do?
Well, it's extraordinary that they felt necessary to do it. And it wasn't just the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Last week, there was an editorial written in one of the newspapers, an op-ed column, by 10 former U.S. Secretaries of Defense, ranging from Dick Cheney and, right-wing Secretaries of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, all the way through to all the Democratic Secretaries of Defense, saying, troops need to follow the Constitution. Clearly, somewhere in the United States military, there was a concern about how this was going to be handled. And I would add that, compounding fears of that are the fact that the Secretary of Defense quit. He said, I'm not going to stay in this government any longer, as did by the way, the Attorney General, who was no great friend of civil liberties, but he also said, I'm not going to have any part of this because there are lines that can't be crossed. And I think there was a real sense within the U.S. military that Donald Trump expected that people in the military, his generals, the military that he was fighting for to, as he always talked about it, we had no ammunition before I became president. And then I gave them ammunition. I mean, it was completely ludicrous, but this is what he would say. He thought they would stand up for him, that the police and the military were on his side. And so he would be able to force himself through these things. And, that sounds very familiar in Latin America. In the United States, it is, it's from another planet. We've never seen it. We are unprepared for it. Foreign policy people have seen it someplace else, but the average American finds it really, really hard to believe.
Wow. But still staying in the domestic front, what's your prediction about what's going to happen with Donald Trump in the next few months and the next few years? Is he going to stay around?
I have a view that is, I have to say, is not the majority view. I think there are a lot of people who think that because there are a lot of alienated Republicans who supported him, that he will remain a force in the Republican Party. And somebody released, a ridiculous poll today on, ranking the 2024 presidential contenders. And, Donald Trump was at the top of the list. Well, 2024 is, eons away from now. And, the day that Donald Trump leaves office, he can be charged with crimes. I mean, frankly, he could have been charged with crimes, before, but there's some dispute within the Department of Justice about whether you can charge a sitting president. Okay, but the day after you leave the office, you can be charged. And even if he were to get a pardon from himself, because he's gotten into a very bad way with his vice president. I think there was some expectation that he might resign a little early and leave the vice president, and the vice president would pardon him. But the vice president doesn't like him anymore. He doesn't like the vice president, and I think he doesn't think the vice president would do that for him anymore. So even if he had a pardon, the state of New York can come after him. The federal government can come after him for things that he hasn't been charged with. The District of Columbia can come after him. Other states can come after him. I think he's going to have big legal troubles. Deutsche Bank, which was the only bank that would lend to him, said a couple of days ago they're not lending to him anymore. He's got $400 million in debt coming due over the next 2 years that he has personally guaranteed. People are not going to use his facilities. The Professional Golfers Tour in the United States said they're not going to hold their championship at one of his golf courses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think he's going to have financial problems. I think he's going to have legal problems. And I think as information that he sought to hide as president, whether it's about Russia, whether it's about Ukraine, whether it's about Khashoggi, the murder of the Washington Post reporter Khashoggi, whether it's about corruption, whether it's about this insurrection, a lot of information is going to come out that has been hidden. And so I think Donald Trump is going to become a deeply, deeply discredited figure. The Republican Party will ultimately want to run away from him. And I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't spend his final years in the United States.
Wow.
Okay. I do have another question here for one of our guests. Considering the bipolar system in the American foreign policy, that entail with each presidential power shift from one party to the other, do you think it is realistic to think that the United States will be able to face the political, economic, and strategic challenge of China's rise? Apparently, the state of today's democracies and their internal competition and self-distractions would not have enough consistency to balance an autocratic like China.
I feel the same question could have been asked at the height of the Cold War about Russia, and they failed because autocratic regimes are not really good at adapting. Autocratic regimes that have a tendency to want to control information flows, leave parts of their population without information. They need to compete. Autocratic regimes have to focus an awful lot of their time and energy on keeping power because they are not the choice of the people. The United States has gone through a remarkable period, a period in which many of the weaknesses in our system have been revealed. I would point out to you, however, that Donald Trump, despite being the president of the United States, a very powerful guy, despite having raised hundreds of millions of dollars, despite having a lot of big forces behind him, lost the election by 8 million votes. That in the state of Georgia, which was a Republican state for most of the past 40 years, Two Democrats won. The Democrats took over the control of the United States Senate. They maintained control of the US House of Representatives. When Donald Trump called upon thousands of supporters to come to the Capitol and seize the Capitol, they were repulsed, they were arrested, the Congress went on about its business, and Trump was impeached again within just a matter of days. So I think, you may say the past few years have shown weakness in the United States. You could also say they've shown resilience and strength. And I also think that the tension between having two political parties, and without getting into the relative health of those parties right now, tends to produce a debate that tends to require us to reevaluate who we are on a regular basis, and on a regular basis leads to improvement. Now, it has failed in some ways that I think we're not talking about here. I think this growth of inequality in the United States is unsustainable. I think having a government that serves essentially an oligarchic elite, which we have in the United States, is unsustainable. I think that that's why the progressive element in the Democratic Party is getting somewhat stronger. And Joe Biden, although he was seen as a centrist, has embraced a much more progressive kind of view in his cabinet, which surprises people. All the Bob Rubin children of Wall Street, the people that, Karen knows pretty well, but, Larry Summers and Tim Geithner and that crowd, none of them got back into this administration. The new Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, who's extremely experienced, is much more from the academic world. The financial minds in this administration are not as opposed to deficit spending as they were. And issues like social justice are much more upfront. Say what you will about Joe Biden. Last night, he stood up and he said, I want to raise the minimum wage in the United States to $15 an hour. Well, the minimum wage hasn't changed in the United States in 2 decades. This is a big deal. In real terms, the minimum wage hasn't changed in the United States in 40 years. Saying that there should never be anybody who goes hungry in the United States, you may take that for granted. But that's a big deal. And so I see a movement, slow, far too slow, towards social justice and sanity in the United States. And I find that very encouraging.
Great, that's encouraging. John, I think we ran out of time, so I don't know if you want to close it and thank David on behalf of our joint Athena Lab and Columbia University Alliance.
We could be another hour talking with David, but time is up. Well, as a member of Athena Lab, I would like to express our gratitude to, first of all, David Rothkofp for accepting our invitation to share with us your thought regarding new political cycle at the U.S. As you know, the U.S. is such an important country all over the world, and especially for our region. Thank you very much indeed, David. And additionally, I would like to thank also to Karen Poniatchit, our director of Columbia Global Center in Santiago, Chile, for her permanent cooperation with Athena Lab. Thank you, Karen, indeed, very much.
Thank you, John, and thanks, David. So we'll be calling you throughout the year.
Sure.
To follow U.S. policy.
Well, thank you. I was, I was educated at Columbia, and I taught for many, many years at Columbia's SEPA. And one of the things that I learned in all of those years of study is always do what Karen says.
There you have it.
We have learned the same here in Chile too. And last but not least, to all the participants on this conference, traditional friends of our center, thank you very much indeed, and have for all of you a very nice weekend. Thank you very much, and
stay safe. It's dangerous outside. Stay
yes,
safe.
it is.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very
Ciao.
much. Bye. Thank you, Karen.